My name is Ellen Cooper. I'm 39 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as someone dependable, a steady presence, the kind of woman people assume will keep things running smoothly without asking too many questions. I worked, I maintained a home, I listened more than I spoke. I believed in consistency, in keeping promises, in the quiet dignity of doing what needed to be done without applause. People often described me as reasonable. That word followed me everywhere. Reasonable wife, reasonable colleague, reasonable woman. What they really meant was that I didn't push back. I didn't dramatize my feelings. I didn't demand emotional center stage. I made space for others and convinced myself that it was a strength. From the outside, my marriage looked solid. Not flashy, not chaotic, just stable. We had routines, shared responsibilities, and a life that appeared orderly enough to be trusted. Friends would say we were low drama. Family said we were mature. No one worried about me. And that, I think, was the first mistake, assuming that silence means safety. This story isn't about a scandal. It isn't about revenge or public humiliation. It's about something quieter and far more unsettling. What happens when the person closest to you accuses you of betrayal, not because you're guilty, but because they are? My husband accused me of adultery, not in rage, not in desperation, but with a calm certainty, as though he had already rehearsed the conclusion and only needed me to accept it. There were no explosive fights, no dramatic ultimatums, just questions that sounded like concern, doubts framed as logic, suspicion presented as responsibility. And slowly, almost invisibly, the ground beneath me began to shift. What you're about to hear is not a story about proving innocence. It's about recognizing projection, about understanding how someone can use accusation as camouflage, and how truth has a way of surfacing, not through confrontation, but through observation, through patience, through restraint. I won't pretend I saw everything immediately. I didn't. I rationalized, I minimized, I told myself I was overthinking. I wanted to believe that trust, once given, was enough to hold everything together. But clarity doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments, in patterns, in moments that don't make sense until they suddenly do. This is a story about emotional justice, not emotional revenge. About quiet dominance, not loud victory. About the psychological reversal that occurs when the person doing the accusing realizes, too late, that the truth no longer needs their permission to exist. If you're listening because you've ever been questioned, doubted, or subtly rewritten in someone else's version of events, I want you to know this. This story isn't meant to inflame. It's meant to be honest, calm, grounded, real. So before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever been blamed for something that deep down you knew was never really about you? Before anything fractured, before suspicion entered the room and changed the air, I had a very clear role in other people's lives. I was the reasonable one in my marriage. That meant I was the stabilizer, the one who remembered appointments, smoothed conversations, and anticipated needs before they were spoken. If there was tension, I absorbed it quietly. If there was discomfort, I reframed it into something manageable. I didn't do this because anyone demanded it of me explicitly. I did it because it was expected, and because I had learned early on that being low maintenance made life easier for everyone else. My husband liked to say I was easy to trust. He said it as praise. He told friends I was grounded, not emotional, not dramatic. He would laugh and say, "Ellen doesn't overthink things." And I would smile, because at the time, I thought that was a virtue. I thought restraint meant maturity. At family gatherings, I was the listener. At work, I was the reliable middle, the person who filled gaps, translated tensions, and kept projects from derailing. I wasn't invisible exactly. I was present in a way that didn't interrupt the flow of other people's importance. And I didn't resent it, not then. What I didn't realize was how thoroughly I had been categorized. Once people decide who you are, they stop checking if that definition still fits. They stop noticing subtle shifts in your posture, your silence, your eyes. They assume continuity where there may be quite a change. To my husband, I was predictable, not boring, safe. Someone who wouldn't surprise him, someone who wouldn't challenge his version of reality, unless something was undeniably wrong. He believed. I trusted him completely, and in many ways, I did. But more than that, he believed I wouldn't look too closely. I managed the home without fanfare. I adapted to his schedule. I adjusted my needs to fit the margins of his day. If something felt off, I waited for it to pass. If a comment landed sharply, I told myself it wasn't intentional. I was skilled at contextualizing other people's behavior in the most generous way possible. That generosity became part of my identity. Friends came to me when they needed perspective, calm advice, someone to validate complexity instead of choosing sides. I was proud of that. I thought emotional steadiness was a strength. I didn't yet understand the difference between stability and self-erasure. Looking back, there were moments, small ones, where I could have redefined myself, where I could have spoken sooner, asked harder questions, taken up more space. But at the time, nothing felt urgent enough to justify disruption. And disruption was something I avoided instinctively. I wasn't unhappy. That's important to say. I wasn't living in misery or fear. I was living in a narrowed version of myself that felt normal because it had formed gradually, like a room you don't realize is dim until someone opens a window. My husband relied on my consistency, on my silence, on my assumption of goodwill. He trusted my loyalty, not because he earned it daily, but because it had always been there. And I think, without realizing it, he began to confuse my trust with blindness. To him, I was the last person who would suspect anything, the last person who would connect the dots, the last person who would sit quietly and observe instead of reacting. That perception shaped everything that followed. I didn't know yet that being underestimated creates a certain kind of freedom. That's when people think they understand you completely. They stop performing for you. They reveal themselves in fragments, in habits, in the inconsistencies they assume you'll overlook. At that stage, though, I was simply Ellen, the reasonable wife, the calm presence, the woman whose steadiness made other people comfortable. And comfort, I would eventually learn, can make people careless. The first moment didn't arrive with drama. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no immediate sense that something important had shifted. In fact, if I hadn't already been someone who paid attention to tone, I might have missed it entirely. It happened on an ordinary evening. We were in the kitchen, talking about nothing particularly meaningful. Weekend plans, work schedules, the usual inventory of shared life. I mentioned, casually, that a colleague had invited me to a small after-work gathering. I wasn't asking permission. I wasn't even sure I would go. I was simply narrating my day. the way people do in relationships built on routine. My husband paused, just briefly. Then he smiled, not warmly, but in a way that felt rehearsed. That's new, he said. I asked what he meant. You going out more? He replied. You never used to. The words themselves weren't sharp, but the way he said them carried something else, an implication I couldn't quite place yet. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't interesting. It was an assessment. I laughed it off. I said something light, something reassuring. I always did. He nodded, but his eyes didn't follow the humor. They lingered, as if cataloging a detail he intended to remember later. That was the first small cut, not painful, not even visible, just enough to register. After that, there were comments disguised as observations, questions framed as jokes. He would ask who I'd been texting, then wave it away before I could answer. He'd remark on how long errands took, how often I checked my phone, always casually, always with plausible deniability. If I mentioned it to anyone else, they would have shrugged. He's just curious, probably stressed. You're reading too much into it. And I would agree, because I wanted to believe them, because nothing had happened yet. But my body remembered what my mind tried to dismiss. There's a particular sensation that comes with subtle disrespect. It's not anger, it's a slight contraction, a tightening somewhere behind the ribs, a sense of being evaluated rather than known. One evening, weeks later, we were watching television when he asked, out of nowhere, if I was happy. I said yes. He nodded, then said, You just seem distracted lately. He didn't ask why. He let the statement hang there, unfinished. I felt myself filling the silence, explaining, reassuring, accounting for my own emotional state as if it required justification. He accepted my explanation too easily. That's what stayed with me. People who are genuinely concerned ask follow-up questions. They lean in. They want clarity. He didn't. He seemed satisfied once I had done the work of smoothing the moment over. From the outside, nothing had changed. Our routines remained intact. He was polite, affectionate even, but something in the dynamic had shifted slightly off-center, and I was the only one adjusting my posture to compensate. I began to notice how often I preempted his doubts, how I volunteered information before it was requested, how I subtly modified my behavior to avoid triggering those small, assessing pauses. None of this felt dramatic enough to confront. That was the problem. Each moment, on its own, was too minor to justify discomfort. But together, they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. And still, I said nothing. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't yet have language for what I was sensing. I only knew that I was being looked at differently, not with suspicion exactly, but with calculation. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar, but it changed the way I paid attention. And once attention shifts, it doesn't easily return to innocence. Once something happens more than once, the mind begins to accommodate it. That's how it started for me, not with acceptance, but with explanation. Each small comment, each subtle implication, I translated into something harmless. Stress at work, fatigue, miscommunication. I told myself that long-term relationships naturally develop rough edges, and that reading too much into them was a sign of emotional immaturity. So I stayed quiet. When my husband questioned my schedule, I answered calmly. When he asked where I had been, I supplied details I hadn't needed to give before. When he raised an eyebrow at a message notification lighting up my phone, I smiled and turned the screen toward him without being asked. I framed this as transparency, as a partnership, What I didn't acknowledge was how one-sided that transparency had become. He never offered his phone, never explained his late nights, unless prompted. When he did, the explanations were vague but delivered with confidence, as if that alone should be sufficient. And because I had always trusted him, I accepted them. Or rather, I told myself I did. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It arrives as a slow rebalancing of who is allowed to ask questions and who is expected to answer them. Over time, I became aware that I was being measured against a standard that didn't apply to him. If I came home late, it warranted a comment. If he did, it was just work. If I seemed distracted, it became a topic. If he was distant, it went unremarked. If I forgot something small, it was noted. If he did, it was inconsequential. I didn't call it out because nothing crossed an obvious line. There was no accusation yet, no confrontation I could point to and say, "This is wrong." Instead, there was a steady drip of implication that required me to stay alert, careful, and composed. I adapted without realizing it. I started anticipating questions before they were asked. I organized my days around minimizing misunderstandings. I adjusted my tone to sound reassuring, even when I hadn't done anything that required reassurance. And slowly, I began to see myself through his lens. I wondered if I was changing, if maybe I had become less present without noticing, if perhaps my attention had drifted in ways that justified his unease. I examined my own behavior more critically than I ever examined his. That's the danger of normalized disrespect. It turns inward. It convinces you that self-scrutiny is a responsibility, when in reality, it's displacement. Friends noticed I was quieter, not withdrawn, just more measured. I listened even more than before. I avoided talking about my marriage in any depth, not because I was hiding something, but because I didn't want to sound dramatic over what I still considered nothing. Because how do you explain a pattern without an incident? When I did attempt to raise a concern once, very gently, he laughed, not cruelly, just dismissively. "You're overthinking," he said. "You always do that." That sentence landed harder than he realized, not because it was loud, but because it reframed my perception as a flaw. It suggested that my awareness was the problem, not the behavior that prompted it. And I let that narrative stand. From that point on, I learned to edit myself more carefully. I didn't bring things up unless I could articulate them perfectly. I waited until I was absolutely certain. And because certainty is difficult to achieve when someone keeps moving the goalposts, I waited a long time. In the meantime, his comments grew slightly more pointed, still subtle, still defensible. He would mention fidelity in abstract ways, reference stories about cheating couples with unusual interests, ask hypothetical questions that felt oddly specific. Each time I responded with calm neutrality. What I didn't realize was that my silence was being interpreted not as grace, but as compliance. When disrespect becomes familiar, it loses its urgency. You stop seeing it as a signal and start treating it as weather, unpleasant, but unavoidable. And in doing so, you teach people how much space they're allowed to take from you. I told myself I was choosing peace. I didn't yet understand that peace without truth is just quiet erosion. It wasn't a single moment of realization. It was more like stepping back and finally seeing the outline of something that had been there all along. I had been assigned a role, not formally, not consciously, but consistently. In my marriage, I was the one who made things easier to manage, easier to explain, easier to ignore when inconvenient. I was expected to be steady regardless of circumstance, accommodating regardless of tone, understanding regardless of imbalance. I began to notice how rarely my emotions shaped the direction of our conversations. They were acknowledged only if they aligned with harmony. Anything that introduced discomfort was subtly redirected, softened, or dismissed. When I expressed fatigue, it was treated as stress. When I expressed concern, it was reframed as anxiety. When I expressed clarity, it was labeled as overthinking. The message was never explicit, but it was consistent. My value lay in my ability to remain functional. I was reliable, useful, invisible when necessary. My husband leaned on this without malice, but also without reflection. He relied on my adaptability to absorb what he didn't want to confront. And because I had always been capable, he assumed I always would be. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being needed, but not considered. From being appreciated for your output, not your presence. I didn't articulate this to myself at first. I just felt increasingly reduced. I managed logistics. I supported his ambitions. I maintained emotional equilibrium. And in doing so, I became less of a partner and more of an infrastructure. What unsettled me most was how predictable my responses had become, to him and to myself. I could feel when a conversation was drifting towards something that might require him to self-reflect, and I would instinctively steer it away. Not because he asked me to, but because I knew the role I was expected to play. I was the one who understood, the one who didn't complicate things, the one who didn't need reassurance. And because I fulfilled that role so well, no one questioned whether it still fit. The accusations hadn't started yet, not openly, but the groundwork was being laid. I could sense it in the way he framed conversations, in the way he positioned himself as observant, and me as potentially errant, in the way my calm was taken for granted, while his doubts were treated as reasonable. I began to see how the narrative could shift effortlessly if needed, how my quiet nature could be reinterpreted as secrecy, how my independence could be reframed as distance, how my trust could be twisted into naivete. And still, I said nothing, because once you recognize the role you've been assigned, stepping out of it feels disruptive, almost irresponsible. You worry about what will happen if you stop holding everything together. What I didn't yet understand was that roles like mine are not neutral. They are convenient. And convenience, when left unexamined, becomes entitlement. I started paying closer attention, not just to what was said, but to what was assumed, to how often my compliance was expected rather than requested, how rarely my perspective altered the outcome of anything that mattered. This wasn't about control in the dramatic sense, it was about inertia, about a dynamic that benefited from my consistency while eroding my agency. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. Because once you see the shape of the box you've been placed in, you have two choices. Keep fitting yourself inside it, or begin, quietly, to measure its edges. That was the moment I stopped reacting and started observing. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen in the middle of a revelation or a confession. There was no dramatic trigger that forced clarity into my hands. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was alone in the house, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The light through the window was flat and ordinary, the kind that makes everything look exactly as it is. No warmth, no shadows to hide in. I had just finished answering a message from my husband, something routine about dinner plans. I remember placing my phone face down, not out of anger, but out of instinct. And then I felt it, a stillness. Not calm, not fear, just a sudden absence of noise inside my head. For months, I had been narrating my own behavior to myself, checking it for flaws, rehearsing explanations I hadn't been asked to give yet. That afternoon, the narration stopped. In its place was a single quiet thought that arrived without effort. I don't actually feel guilty. The thought surprised me with its simplicity. I sat with it, turning it over slowly. I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't crossed boundaries. I hadn't lied, hidden, or strayed. And yet, I had been carrying the posture of someone under suspicion. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me curious. If I wasn't guilty, why was I behaving like I needed to prove something? I began replaying the past months in reverse. Not emotionally, but analytically. The comments, the pauses, the questions that weren't really questions, the way he introduced doubt without evidence, then waited for me to neutralize it. I noticed something else then, something I hadn't allowed myself to notice before. How rarely his accusations, even subtle ones, came with genuine confusion. They weren't seeking clarity. They were asserting a frame. That afternoon, instead of dismissing the discomfort, I let it exist. I didn't rush to resolve it. I didn't call a friend. I didn't confront him. I simply allowed myself to sit with the possibility that something was being misdirected. Projection is difficult to see when you're busy defending yourself. I realized I had been working very hard to maintain a version of myself that felt palatable to someone who had already decided how to see me. And in doing so, I had stopped checking whether his behavior aligned with the standards he expected of me. The shift wasn't a decision. It was a recalibration. That evening, when he came home, nothing outwardly changed. I listened as usual. I responded politely. But internally, I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't preempting. I wasn't filling silences. When he made a small remark about my day, something that, before, would have prompted explanation, I simply acknowledged it and moved on. I didn't offer context. I didn't defend. I didn't perform reassurance. He noticed, not consciously perhaps, but I saw it in the way he paused, just slightly, as if waiting for a response that didn't arrive. The dynamic had shifted, even if he couldn't yet name how. That was the day I understood something fundamental. Silence doesn't have to be avoidance. It can be alignment. I wasn't withdrawing. I was returning to myself. I began to trust my internal signals again, to treat discomfort as information rather than something to be neutralized. I stopped assuming that harmony was the highest good. That day didn't fix anything. It didn't expose the truth or resolve the conflict, but it marked the end of my confusion. From that point on, I wasn't trying to prove my innocence. I was trying to understand the situation clearly. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't ask for permission to stay. After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, something I used to smooth over moments, to keep things comfortable, to avoid misinterpretation. Now, it has become deliberate, not cold, not punishing, just intentional. I stopped narrating myself. When my husband asked where I'd been, I answered the question and nothing more. When he commented on my schedule, I acknowledged it without reshaping my day to fit his expectations. I didn't challenge him. I didn't confront him. I simply stopped overfunctioning. At first, this went unnoticed. People often mistake consistency for permanence. He had grown used to my responsiveness, my explanations, my gentle emotional labor. When it disappeared, it didn't register as a boundary. It registered as a pause. Something temporary. Something he assumed would correct itself. Silence has a way of unsettling people who rely on noise to stay in control. He began repeating questions, asking them in slightly different ways, revisiting topics we had already covered. Before, I would have filled those repetitions with reassurance. Now, I let them stand. What time did you say you'd be home? I already answered that. Oh, right. There was no edge in my voice, no defensiveness, just neutrality. That neutrality was new. Without my constant adjustments, he had to sit with his own thoughts longer. And instead of bringing clarity, that seemed to increase his unease. His comments became more frequent, though not more direct. He started phrasing them as observations again, watching to see if I would correct or soothe. I didn't. Silence, I learned, invites projection to reveal itself. The more I stayed grounded, the more he filled the gaps with assumptions. He interpreted my calm as distance, my distance as secrecy, my secrecy as intent, all without asking a single question that genuinely sought understanding. Others might have called my behavior passive. It wasn't. It was disciplined. I was paying attention to what happened when I stopped managing the emotional environment, to what surfaced when I didn't rush to make things easier. And what surfaced wasn't concern. It was control anxiety. He began framing his discomfort as logic, as intuition, as just a feeling he couldn't shake. And still, there was no evidence, no incident, just certainty without foundation. I realized then that confrontation would be premature, that arguing would only give him something to push against. Silence, on the other hand, gave him space to reveal more, and he did. He started volunteering explanations I hadn't asked for, mentioning work more often, clarifying his whereabouts with unnecessary detail. It was subtle, but the shift was there. The imbalance was beginning to tilt. I stayed consistent, calm, observant. This wasn't about punishment. It was about accuracy. I wanted to understand the full shape of what was happening before naming it. I wanted to be sure. And silence allowed that certainty to form without distortion. People who expect you to react are disoriented when you don't. They begin to test boundaries more openly to provoke responses, to create proof of what they already believe. I let him, not because I was indifferent, but because I was finally aligned with myself. My silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of attention, and attention, when sustained, becomes power. What they never noticed was how observant I had always been. Because I was quiet, people assumed I wasn't tracking details. Because I didn't interrupt, they assumed I wasn't forming conclusions. My calm had been mistaken for passivity for so long that no one thought to question what was happening behind it. That miscalculation gave me time. Once my silence became intentional, my attention sharpened. I wasn't looking for proof yet. I was looking for patterns. I didn't want fragments. I wanted consistency. So I watched without reacting. I listened without signaling interest. I let things unfold at their natural pace, and slowly the inconsistencies surfaced. His schedule became less predictable, but his explanations became more polished. He mentioned names casually, as if repetition would normalize them. He began guarding his phone in ways that felt performative, never secretive enough to accuse, just careful enough to notice. What struck me most wasn't the behavior itself. It was the timing. Every time his suspicion toward me intensified, his own restlessness increased. The accusations didn't come after something I did. They came after something he did. Late nights, sudden distractions, emotional distance he didn't know how to explain. Projection leaves a rhythm if you let it play long enough. I started writing things down, not obsessively, not emotionally, just facts, dates, times, statements made casually that contradicted earlier ones. I didn't label anything. I didn't interpret. I documented. This wasn't about building a case. It was about anchoring reality. When you're being subtly questioned, it's easy to begin doubting your own memory. Documentation interrupts that erosion. It creates a fixed point you can return to when doubt tries to rewrite events. I also began learning, quietly. I read about psychological projection, not in sensational articles, but in clinical language. I learned how people externalize guilt to avoid self-confrontation, how accusation can be a form of emotional offloading, how control often masquerades as concern. None of this made me feel vindicated. It made me calm, because clarity is grounding. I noticed how his accusations never escalated into action. There were no requests for transparency beyond what benefited him. No effort to repair trust. Just a suspicion that required my reassurance and nothing from him in return. That told me everything. Meanwhile, I positioned myself carefully. I didn't change my routines abruptly. I didn't withdraw socially. I didn't signal awareness. I remained consistent enough to avoid triggering defensive shifts. People often think preparation looks dramatic. It doesn't. It looks like patience. I made sure my finances were in order, not as an exit plan, just as a principle. I reviewed shared accounts. I ensured my personal documents were accessible. I reconnected with my own sense of independence in small, practical ways, all without announcing anything. He didn't notice any of this because he was too focused on managing his own narrative. When people believe they are ahead of you, they stop watching their steps. They assume your silence means ignorance. They confuse dignity with compliance. And so he revealed more, not through confession, but through carelessness, through slips in language, through defensiveness where none was required, through the increasing urgency of his accusations, which no longer matched my behavior at all. That mismatch was the clearest signal. I didn't confront it. I didn't need to. I was no longer trying to be understood by him. I was trying to understand the truth. And the truth was forming steadily, quietly, without resistance. What they never noticed was that I had stopped needing validation, that I wasn't waiting to be believed, that I was building certainty privately, piece by piece. By the time the realization arrived, it wasn't shocking. It was inevitable. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no surge of triumph, no sense of "I knew it." What I felt instead was a quiet confirmation, like a final piece settling into place after a long period of careful observation. It happened late one evening when I wasn't looking for anything. That detail matters. I wasn't searching his phone. I wasn't tracking him. I wasn't trying to catch him in a lie. I had learned by then that truth doesn't need pursuit when it's already straining to surface. He had left his laptop open on the desk in the study, something he rarely did. A message notification appeared briefly in the corner of the screen before fading. I didn't read it fully. I didn't need to. The name alone was enough to register as unfamiliar in a way that felt deliberate, not incidental. I didn't touch the laptop. I sat down instead, and I let myself think. What I felt in that moment wasn't betrayal. It was alignment. Everything. The timing of his accusations, The sharpening suspicion, the defensiveness wrapped in logic, finally made sense without requiring emotional justification. Projection, once exposed, loses its power. Over the following days, I allowed the picture to clarify itself naturally. I didn't interrogate. I didn't provoke. I simply paid attention. Patterns tightened, stories shortened, explanations became overly precise. I noticed how his accusations toward me intensified whenever his phone stayed face down on the table, how his concern peaked after evenings he returned unusually energized, then oddly withdrawn, how he monitored my movements more closely during periods when he himself was less available. This wasn't intuition anymore. It was confirmation. I documented nothing new during this phase, not because there was nothing to note, but because I no longer needed to. The story had reached internal coherence. I didn't require proof to confront him. I required certainty to decide what I would do. That was the real reveal. Not his affair, but my leverage. Leverage isn't always about evidence. Sometimes it's about timing, composure, and choice. About knowing more than the other person believes you know, and deciding whether that knowledge needs to be spoken at all. I felt no urge to expose him, no desire to shame, no impulse to win, because once projection is understood, the dynamic reverses. He thought he was ahead of me, thought his accusations kept me reactive, defensive, and uncertain. What he didn't see was that each accusation had trained me to detach emotionally while sharpening my perception. I didn't confront him that night. I slept. And when I woke up, I felt steady. That steadiness told me something important. I was no longer emotionally dependent on his version of reality. I wasn't waiting for him to admit anything. I wasn't hoping for an explanation that would restore balance. Balance had already returned to me. The private reveal wasn't something I shared with anyone. Not friends, not family, not even myself out loud. It lived quietly in my posture, my decisions, and my patience. And that restraint mattered, because confrontation would come later, not as a reaction, but as a conclusion. At that point, I had options. And options are a form of power that doesn't announce itself. I wasn't angry enough to rush. I wasn't hurt enough to collapse. I was clear enough to choose carefully. That clarity was irreversible. Once you know the truth, time changes shape. Moments slow down. Conversations take on double meanings. Every interaction becomes layered with awareness. Not heavy, but precise. I was no longer reacting to what was happening. I was considering what could happen, depending on what I chose to do next. That was the decision point. I didn't experience it as a dramatic crossroads. There was no single night of agonizing back and forth. Instead, I mapped my options calmly, almost clinically, as if I were advising someone else. I could confront him immediately, say the words out loud, force a confession or a denial. That path would satisfy urgency, but it would also hand him control of the narrative, his explanations, his justifications, his emotional framing. I could gather undeniable evidence, wait for something concrete enough to remove all ambiguity. But that would require deeper intrusion, more emotional investment, and a willingness to live in suspicion longer than I was prepared to. I could leave quietly without explanation, protect myself by disappearing from the dynamic entirely. But that would mean carrying unanswered questions and allowing him to tell whatever version of the story suited him. Or I could do something else. I could move in silence. I could let the truth remain unspoken while I aligned my life around it. I could allow his own behavior to continue revealing itself without interference. I could choose dignity over urgency. That was the option I chose, not because it was easier, but because it was irreversible in the right way. Once you stop seeking validation from someone who is projecting, you can't go back. Once you see the pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. Once you decide not to play defense, the game itself changes. I didn't tell him I knew. Instead, I adjusted my expectations internally. I stopped planning around him, stopped investing emotionally in the repair that only I was attempting. I focused on my own stability, financial, logistical, psychological. This wasn't withdrawal. It was recentering. He sensed the change, though he couldn't name it. His accusations sharpened briefly, then softened, as if he were testing different approaches to regain footing. When neither provoked the reaction he expected, he grew unsettled. That unsettledness confirmed my choice. People who are secure don't need to accuse. People who are honest don't need to control perception. And people who sense they're losing influence often reveal more than they intend to. I watched without interfering. The decision I made wasn't to leave yet. It wasn't time to confront yet. It was to stop sacrificing my clarity for the sake of peace. That decision didn't require his participation. It required mine. And once it was made, everything that followed became a matter of timing, not uncertainty. After the decision, my life became quieter, not on the surface, but underneath. I moved through our days as I always had. Same routines, same conversations, same measured tone. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed a subtle shift in emphasis. I spoke less about the future. I asked fewer questions about his plans. I no longer built my schedule around his availability, but no one was watching that closely. Silence is disarming because it looks like continuity. It doesn't alert people to change. It doesn't trigger defenses. And that allowed me to prepare without interference. I began with practicalities. I reviewed our shared finances methodically, the way someone does when they're checking a system, not planning an escape. I made copies of important documents. I ensured I had access to everything I might need later, not because I intended to leave immediately, but because not having access creates vulnerability. I updated my personal accounts. I reestablished credit in my own name. Small things, invisible things, the kind of steps that don't announce intention, but create stability. At work, I leaned into autonomy, took on responsibilities that strengthened my position without increasing my dependence. I wasn't ambitious in a performative way. I was deliberate. I also began reclaiming my time, not dramatically, just consistently. I spent evenings reading instead of filling silences with conversation. I reconnected with parts of myself that had been on standby for years, not as a rebellion, but as a return. He didn't question it at first. Why would he? I was still present, still composed, still fulfilling the role he expected, just without the emotional surplus he had grown accustomed to receiving. What he didn't notice was how little I relied on his perception anymore. When he made insinuations, I didn't correct them. I didn't absorb them. I let them pass through without attachment. That detachment was the most significant shift and the least visible. I stopped sharing internal states. That's an important distinction. I wasn't hiding. I was simply no longer offering access to my emotional landscape without invitation or reciprocity. Meanwhile, his behavior continued to oscillate. Periods of attentiveness followed by withdrawal. Moments of warmth followed by suspicion. Each cycle reinforced the same conclusion. This wasn't about me. Still, I waited, not out of fear, but out of respect for the process. I wanted my next step, whatever it would be, to come from grounded clarity, not reaction. People often think decisive moments are loud. They aren't. They're quiet, almost unremarkable, until you look back and realize everything changed there. That's what this period was, a bridge between awareness and action, a time when nothing seemed different, yet nothing was the same. I was no longer orienting my life around someone else's uncertainty. I was moving in silence. Consequences rarely arrive as punishment. More often, they arrive as an absence. The first thing my husband noticed wasn't anger or confrontation. It was the lack of something he had always assumed would be there. The emotional cushioning, the automatic reassurance, the quiet way I used to absorb uncertainty so he didn't have to sit with it himself. At first, he seemed confused. He would make a comment designed to provoke a response, something lightly accusatory, something that previously would have drawn explanation or defense. When it didn't, he would pause, as if waiting for a delayed reaction. It never came. That absence unsettled him more than any argument would have. He began repeating himself more often, circling the same topics as if trying to re-anchor the dynamic. But repetition without engagement doesn't create control. It exposes reliance. I watched as he grew increasingly aware of a loss he couldn't name, not of love, not of trust, of influence. He started seeking validation in small ways, asking questions that didn't need answers, offering explanations unprompted, testing emotional temperature with exaggerated concern. Before, I would have responded instinctively, smoothing the moment, restoring equilibrium. Now I simply acknowledged what was said and let it rest. I wasn't withholding. I was complete. That difference matters. Without my emotional labor, the imbalance became visible, not to me, but to him. He began misreading my calm as detachment, then as a threat. His tone shifted subtly, oscillating between reassurance and suspicion. And still, I didn't confront him, because the consequence he was experiencing wasn't something I imposed. It was something he had depended on without recognizing its cost. Other people noticed too. Friends commented on how grounded I seemed, more self-contained, less inclined to over-explain. They read it as confidence. And in a way, they were right. What they didn't see was that this grounding had come from letting go of a dynamic that no longer served me. At home, the atmosphere changed, not dramatically, just enough to feel unfamiliar. Conversations shortened, silences stretched. He filled them with questions that no longer found traction. He began to second-guess himself. Accusations softened into uncertainty, certainty into speculation. The authority he had carried in his assumptions began to erode under the weight of his own inconsistency. This is what happens when projection loses its target. Without my participation, his narrative collapsed inward. He became restless, defensive, occasionally apologetic, though never specific. I accepted the apologies without discussion, not because they mattered, but because they revealed something important. He was no longer sure of his footing. That shift marked the beginning of the end, not because I ended anything, but because the structure he had relied on no longer held. Consequences don't need to be announced. Sometimes they simply unfold. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, he was already behind it. That's the quiet truth about certain endings. You don't recognize them while they're forming. You only feel them once they've passed the point where intention still matters. His behavior changed again, but this time, the shift carried urgency. He became more attentive in visible ways, asked how my day was with exaggerated care, suggested dinners out, small gestures that would have meant something months earlier. He laughed more loudly, touched my arm more often, spoke about us with a softness that felt practiced rather than natural. It was the tone of someone trying to restore a version of reality that no longer existed. I noticed something else, too. The accusations stopped, not because trust had returned, but because doubt had turned inward. The questions he once directed at me now lived behind his eyes. He was recalculating, replaying past interactions, searching for the moment he lost control of the story. People often believe the absence of accusation means repair. It doesn't. It means fear has replaced confidence. He tried to talk, carefully, indirectly. He asked whether I felt distant, whether something had changed, whether I was unhappy. I answered honestly, but not expansively. I'm fine, I said, and I was. Not because things were resolved, but because I had resolved myself. That distinction frustrated him. He wanted dissatisfaction he could fix, anger he could soothe, emotion he could manage. What he encountered instead was neutrality. Neutrality offers no leverage. That's when panic began to show. He revisited old conversations, reframed past moments as misunderstandings, and apologized for things without naming them. He attempted repair without accountability, reconciliation without truth. It was too late for that. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because I was no longer willing to rebuild something on denial. I could see him trying to outrun consequences he didn't fully understand. He sensed loss without being able to locate its source. He didn't yet know I was no longer orienting my decisions around him. And that was irreversible. There's a moment in every unraveling where effort arrives after relevance has expired, where intention comes too late to matter. That was where we were. I didn't gloat. I didn't confront. I didn't announce anything. I simply continued living from clarity instead of confusion. His attempts grew less subtle. He asked directly whether I still trusted him, whether I believed in our marriage, whether I was committed. Each question revealed the same truth. He was asking for reassurance he had already forfeited. Trust doesn't disappear in a moment. It erodes when accountability is avoided for too long. I realized then that even if he confessed everything, every detail, every lie, it wouldn't change the fundamental shift that had already occurred inside me. The dynamic was broken not by infidelity alone, but by projection, control, and the quiet expectation that I would carry emotional weight that wasn't mine. That weight was gone now, and without it, there was nothing left for him to negotiate. Some endings don't require confrontation to be final. They become final when one person stops hoping the other will become someone different. By the time he understood that something could not be fixed, I was already standing somewhere else internally, calm, intact, and no longer available for revision. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly quiet. No raised voices, no tears, no dramatic pauses, waiting for the other person to break. If someone had been listening from the next room, they might not have realized anything significant was taking place at all. It happened on an ordinary evening after dinner. The dishes were still on the counter. The house was calm. Nothing in the setting suggested a turning point, and that felt appropriate. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. He started carefully, as though stepping onto unstable ground. He said he felt distance between us, that he didn't know when it had started, only that it felt serious. He asked if there was something I wasn't telling him. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I didn't rush to respond, not to create tension, but because I didn't need to defend myself anymore. I know, I said finally. That was all. He looked at me, waiting for more. An explanation, an accusation, a confession, something that would allow him to engage emotionally. Nothing came. I know about the affair, I added calmly, not accusing, not dramatic, just factual. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was hollow, the kind that forms when a story collapses, and there's nothing underneath it to hold the shape. He denied it at first, not convincingly, more reflex than strategy. When I didn't react, didn't argue, didn't present evidence, the denial faded on its own. Then came justification, confusion, attempts to contextualize. He spoke about stress, disconnection, and loneliness. He spoke as if naming reasons might soften consequences. I didn't engage with any of it. I'm not here to debate it, I said, and I'm not here to be persuaded. That seemed to disorient him more than anger would have. He asked if I was angry. I thought about it before answering. No, I said. I'm clear. Clarity has a different weight than anger. It doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't rise or fall with emotion. He asked what I wanted to do. That question mattered because it acknowledged, finally, that the decision was no longer his to influence. I'm going to move forward, I said, in a way that's honest for me. I didn't outline plans. I didn't threaten outcomes. I didn't seek agreement. He asked if there was anything he could do. I shook my head. Not now, I said, and not like this. The conversation ended shortly after, not because it was unfinished, but because there was nothing left to clarify. The truth had been named. The dynamic had reversed. The silence that followed wasn't avoidance. It was completion. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled. That's what projection never anticipates. The moment when the person you underestimated doesn't need to prove anything anymore. After everything was named, life didn't fracture the way people expect it to. There was no collapse, no dramatic reinvention, no urge to explain myself to anyone who hadn't lived inside the silence with me. What followed was quieter than that, a gradual return to myself, without the need to perform steadiness for someone else. I am still calm, but my calm is no longer a service I provide. It's a state I choose. For a long time, I believed strength meant absorption, taking in uncertainty, smoothing over discomfort, holding things together even when they were uneven. Now I understand that strength can also mean refusal. Refusal to carry what isn't yours. Refusal to be the stabilizer in a structure that depends on imbalance. I don't over-explain anymore, not because I'm guarded, but because I trust my own clarity. I no longer assume misunderstanding is my fault, or that being doubted requires me to prove myself. If someone questions my integrity without evidence, I don't rush to correct them. I watch what that doubt reveals instead. That change has reshaped my relationships. I listen differently. I speak when something matters to me, not when silence feels uncomfortable for someone else. I let pauses exist without filling them, and in those pauses, people show you who they are. There's no bitterness in this phase of my life. That surprises people. They expect anger, resentment, a hardened edge. What they don't expect is neutrality paired with self-respect. They don't expect someone to walk away internally before walking away physically. I didn't lose myself. I retrieved myself. I still believe in commitment, in honesty, in the idea that relationships can be deep, supportive, and mutual. What I no longer believe is that endurance is proof of love, or that silence should be mistaken for consent. The woman I am now doesn't need to dominate a room to be grounded in it. She doesn't need to be loud to be certain. She doesn't need to expose anyone to feel validated. She understands that quiet dominance comes from alignment between perception and reality, between values and action. What happened didn't make me cynical. It made me precise. I know the difference now between curiosity and control, between concern and projection, between intimacy and access. And I know that being underestimated is not a weakness. It's a temporary condition that reveals itself in time. I move through the world with less urgency to be understood and more confidence in my own discernment. I don't chase closure. I recognize it when it arrives. This isn't a story about surviving betrayal. It's a story about reclaiming authorship. And that, more than anything else, is what changed me. There's a reason I wanted to tell this story slowly, not to build suspense, and not to dramatize what happened, but to honor the way truth actually emerges in real life, quietly, in fragments, through patterns that only become visible when you stop rushing to explain yourself. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that false accusations are rarely about discovering truth. More often, they're about displacing discomfort, about relocating guilt somewhere it doesn't belong, so the person carrying it doesn't have to look at themselves too closely. Projection works best when the other person stays reactive. It needs defense. It needs explanation. It needs emotional noise to survive. What it can't withstand is stillness. I didn't expose my husband to punish him. I didn't confront him to win. And I didn't walk away in anger. I did something quieter and, in the end, more definitive. I stopped participating in a narrative that required my self-doubt to function. That's the moral center of this story. You don't owe anyone access to your emotional labor just because they accuse you. You don't need to prove innocence to someone who isn't genuinely seeking the truth. And you don't need to rush toward confrontation when clarity is still forming. Sometimes the most powerful response is to step back and observe, to let patterns speak, to let silence reveal what words are trying to hide, to let someone else's certainty collapse under its own weight. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over yourself, your reactions, your timing, your sense of reality. When you stop explaining who you are to someone determined to misunderstand you, something remarkable happens. Their influence over you fades, and in that space, your own voice returns, steady, grounded, and unafraid of quiet. If you're listening to this and you recognize pieces of your own life in it, if you've ever felt subtly questioned, slowly reframed, or pressured to defend a truth you already knew, I hope this story gives you permission to pause. Not to escalate, not to retaliate, but to align, because alignment is what makes projection visible. And once it's visible, it loses its power. I'll leave you with one question, one that doesn't demand an answer, but invites reflection. Have you ever noticed how much clarity arrives the moment you stop trying to convince someone of the truth and start trusting your own? Thank you for listening.